Could you hear me? Thank you. Okay. Could we switch on the light? Or no? Is this? Great. Maybe. But you get. Okay, welcome to all. Just a few quick announcements. So the first one, as you already know, this week no lab, okay? Because my teaching assistant is abroad for attending a conference, so he's not able to come. Next week, we will have the second lab on the topic of today, which is word embeddings. So we will try to put into practice what we learned this week. We will focus the today lecture on word-level representations of words based on neural networks, which is one of the core part of this course. Then next we will move on the more ways, the extensions related to text composition at the sentence level, and using some more advanced architectures like transformers. So we will see what is more deep in natural language processing, what deep means, okay? So this is, of course, a very important part. We will spend almost this week focusing more on sentence and word level embeddings, which are the very first ways to embed text that have been proposed in literature, but then we will move on to the most recent state-of-the-art approaches. In the meanwhile, I asked to a colleague of yours to, let me say, coordinate the activities of preparation regarding the group assignment and the team project assignment, the group creation and teamwork project assignment. In a nutshell, you have to build your own team composed of approximately standard team of 3 persons. 2 is okay, 4 is okay. 1 is a very critical case because we have a very high number of students enrolled this year, more than last year, where we have already teams of 2, 3, or 4 persons. So we need to manage to make also the activity of consulting and verification of the project works feasible and affordable for us. Okay, so we asked him to first collect your initial preferences regarding the team members, the composition of the teams. So you could just indicate in a shared Excel file or spreadsheet or doc what are the names of the potential members of your team. You should also indicate a name for a team, just a nickname to identify your team. And you could also express at least a couple of preferences regarding the general topic, the application of NLP that you wanna address in your project. It's not a strict mandatory request. It means that you have to say, okay, I prefer to work on let me say, topic modeling and summarization, or I want to work on, I don't know, question answering and summarization. And then we try to meet your request as best as we can, but we also have to balance, of course, because we have many projects, we have different project assignments, and we assign to you one of these. But we can't assign one project to all of you, so we need to also rebalance the workload, okay? So some teams are working on summarization, some other on machine translation, some other on, so we have to identify some suitable project works first, and then do the assignments in a fair way, and also a feasible way in terms of capacity of teams that we are able to manage. So I asked him to just collect some preliminary information in order to have a big picture of what can be the situation. And then, of course, me and Moreno will try to go through these preliminaries and make decisions, assignments about the team side on. But we need to have some feedbacks from your side, okay? So in the following days, as soon as possible, we will share this document, and we'll ask you to fill this information. So think about which are the colleagues of yours that can be eligible for being your team members. Of course, you should agree on a possible date for the exam written part, because as you know, to have to do the written part, to have the scores, you have completed the project. It's not mandatory, it's optional, but of course, if you want to sum the score of the project with the score of the written part, you must have delivered both. So if a colleague of yours is wondering, would like to not attend, for example, the first examination session, whereas you want, you need to find an agreement, okay? Just think about this and try to figure out a possible arrangement, and then we will go back to this and revert to you as soon as possible. Any questions? Okay, so let me just... Okay, so let's start this new topic called word embeddings. So what we have seen until now is what we call typically traditional natural language processing. What does it mean? It means that we have presented to you some of the most traditional ways to handle textual data, to pre-process text in order to identify some notable syntactical properties, like, for example, finding lemmas, identifying stop words and removing them if need be. Try to parse the text in order to detect some syntactical dependencies, to identify the part of speech to which each token of the text belongs to, for example, a noun, a verb, which are, of course, instrumental for doing some specific application-oriented task, like, for example, question answering or similar, or sentiment analysis. And then, of course, in order to apply some state-of-the-art machine learning and data mining algorithms, like classifiers, clustering algorithms, or pattern mining algorithms, we need to find a suitable way to represent the textual data, because, of course, the raw piece of text is not suitable for being handled by a neural network or whatever other kind of supervised or unsupervised algorithms. So we need a representation model, a way to represent our data, which is, of course, which tries to emphasize the most peculiar characteristics of the underlying data. Mostly, in our case, in the in the previous lecture, we have emphasized the syntactical properties of the text. For example, if words are frequently co-occurring together, because maybe they are the hot keywords, the most recurrent words in your text, we have tried to discover some topics based on word frequency analysis, the frequency-based analysis, which is partly suboptimal because, of course, the frequency is an important aspect, but it's not sufficient to highlight the actual relevance of a word in terms of semantic meaning. So we miss something. We would like to bridge the gap by also adding some semantic level analysis of the text. And this can be done using embedding models, which are an alternative way to represent data. We will see that from now on, we have the new instruments to learn textual representations, which are more expressive in terms of semantic properties, which retain the semantic meaning of the text in a more effective way than traditional ones. Okay, so they are alternative to the standard approaches like the TF-IDF, the occurrence-based one-hot encoding representation. They are not always the best, of course. They have some drawbacks. We will see them later on in this lecture. But they are, of course, in general, more promising and more effective for tackling specific tasks in NLP. So we will see the pros and the cons. And of course, nowadays are among the most established way to represent text. And they can be also combined, of course, between a combination, a mix of frequency-based and vector-based representations of text can be a good option in many cases. But this is a very important topic in our course. So what we call, we denote this kind of representation as vector representation of text, because basically we identify the unit of text we want to represent. In our case, for this, in this lecture, we mainly focus on single words, which is a simplification, of course. We will see that we can do better, we can do more. Given a word in a vocabulary, we want to associate to that word a vector of real numbers. So we will call also this representation embedding, which is also called a dense representation of the text, because it's not simply a discrete representation, a Boolean representation 0, 1. It's a dense representation because it's a series, or it's a vector of real numbers, which are not as expressive as itself, not interpretable as itself, because in the traditional case, as I show you here, it's easy to understand the meaning of a given feature. So if you build your own Word document representation, where each feature in the text consists of a different word in the vocabulary, you exactly know, if you are familiar with that language, the meaning of that word, which can be, in some cases, it can be ambiguous, because the same word can be used in different contexts according to different meanings, of course. So you have to disambiguate, in this case, the meaning. But of course, it retains a certain level of explainability. So you are able to explain the meaning of that feature. Conversely, in word embeddings, you describe the content of a piece of text in terms of vectors, where these vectors are word vectors that describe are associated with single words, and each column, each dimension of that vector is not an explainable meaning, so cannot be associated with a particular property of the text, like a part of speech, or a term in a vocabulary, an engram, or whatever. So it's no meaning. It's not explainable as itself. But we can perform some algebraic operations, some vector operations, in order to compute the similarity between different pieces of text in a very effective way. And this is the key element, the strong point of this representation. We are very effective in computing text similarities. Similarities between single words, but also, as we will see later on, similarities also in sentences or longer pieces of text. That similarity is representative also of some semantic similarity, which is completely disregarded by previous approaches. So if you are able to compute a similarity between two pieces of text, which is not simply how many words are in common, how many verbs, how many nouns, or whether it contains a stop word or not. But you are now able to express something that is more semantic aware, like this. So let me show you. Okay, here, these two words, king and queen, which are the most famous example, introductory example of word embedding, are two words that of the English vocabulary that have some, of course, semantic relationship. So you can figure out that the two words are not completely uncorrelated. Maybe they are uncorrelated from a point of view of frequency-based occurrence, because maybe they occur in different documents, they occur in different pieces of text. One occurs in some sections or some paragraph, one and the other in other. So they are not expected to be present in the same piece of text, and they are not expected to have the same TF-IDF values, because they have no apparent syntactic relationship, but they have a semantic relation, of course. And we would like to highlight these semantic properties because deeply understanding the natural language, either written language or oral or speech, is possible only if you are capable of getting the underlying meaning of the text, which is not simply syntax, but also semantics. So let's start seeing what happens. So what we have done in our previous is to introduce the so-called feature value representation, which is basically a tabular form, a matrix form. The matrix contains a feature document level representation, where actually the document can be even a single sentence or an entire paragraph. Feature is a metadata which describes the content of the data. So the point is that what kind of feature value representation which is the most suitable one, which is the most appropriate? Of course, there is no single answer to this question, because according to the application domain, you will find that you will discover, you will figure out possible different representation, which are different properties, are less effective in some cases, more effective in other cases. You have to define the granularity level of the feature. We have already introduced this aspect because this can be associated with a word, an n-gram, a multi-word, an entity, or whatever kind of piece of text. It can be also associated with related to the structure of the text. Like, for example, if you do sectioning, you identify the section to which a particular piece of text belongs to. Then you can leverage the sectioning structure of the text in order to define your features during the so-called feature engineering part. Okay, so we encode this information in a feature value representation in a matrix form But this representation until now includes some weights that indicate the relevance of a particular combination of feature and document, like a Word document representation based, for example, on binary values, which indicate whether a particular word occurs in a given document or not. So it's a Boolean variable. Or you can do something better, something smarter, like TF-IDF or BM25 scoring. What are the problems that we encounter when we use occurrence-based representation? So first of all, it's high-dimensional. High-dimensional means that you have thousands of features because you have thousands and thousands of textual units, thousands and thousands of words in a dictionary. And it's the simplest case, because if you want to consider an n-gram instead of a single word, the problem gets worse. If you want to consider even the parts of speech, it gets worse again. And if you consider the structure of the text, the parsing, the output of a parser, so the representation is potentially very, very high dimensional. And it's also very sparse, because the units of text you consider are often occur in a relatively small number of documents or pieces of text. For example, a word is likely to occur many times only in a small portion of a document, of a book, for example, whereas most of the other words do not occur at all. So we have a word document representation which is full of zeros. Sparse. The sparse representation is often not suitable enough for getting high performances using machine learning models. Because a sparse data representation, it makes the machine learning algorithm makes more challenging to find relevant patterns, for example, for discovering, for identifying for doing clusters, so to getting similar objects, putting similar objects together, or to assign a class label. So these are critical for many and many machine learning and data mining applications. And then finally, last but not the least, you are not able to encode the semantic properties of the text, because occurrence-based representations mainly rely on syntactic properties. So the cursor dimensionality is really strictly related to the number of input features, which are typically very high. We would like to find a way to capture textual semantic properties and allow us to compare different pieces of text in terms of semantic relations. So we do this by building some alternative vector representation called word embeddings. And we do this with the help of ad hoc neural network models. The very first proposed solutions to solve this problem are actually neural networks, not deep networks. So just simple networks with just one layer, which are suitable enough for tackling the problem, for improving the state of the art. What we do, in a nutshell, is to get a unified representation of our word space, where each word in a dictionary is a point in a space, is a vector in a space. This point, like the word king or the word queen, can be considered as points in a multidimensional space, where, of course, each point is characterized by a set of coordinates. So it can be represented as a vector, as a word vector. And what we would like to achieve is a representation that is able to to retain the most relevant semantic relations. So if, for example, king and queen are similar to each other, we would like that the two corresponding vectors in the shared space are relatively close to each other. So the similarity is very high. With the same for other words, like, for example, king and man. As we will see, we are able also to do something more advanced in terms of analysis of word analogies. So the most common application, one of the very first applications of this kind of models, is called the word analogy, and works like this. So you have some similarities, some relationship between pairs of words, like, for example, king and man, or queen and woman. You try to map these two analogies, like, for example, king is related to man as queen is related to what, and you try to guess woman. Okay? This is, of course, this problem is translated as, is modeled as an algebraic combination of vectors in a space, but is actually a problem that is commonly addressed by linguistic experts. So it's not, prior to word embeddings, these kind of problems were tackled using rule-based models. So in this case, as you can see, if you try to represent the connection, the relation between king and queen and man and woman, they are similar. So they can do some vector operations, some summing and subtracting vectors, simply component by component in the shared space, and you get the correct answers. We will see some examples later on in this presentation. So these are practical examples of applications of this kind of models, which show the effectiveness of this vector representation in capturing the semantic meaning of the text. Of course, here is the main limitation is that the capability of this model is to capture the word level meaning, which can be biased, because the words have a single word is not representative of an entire piece of text. A single word may be used in different documents with different meanings according to the context. So these are not the best model you can apply, but they are still very popular, more effective than previous ones. Okay, so this is what we call dense representation, where concepts are not represented by single specific features, but they are distributed across a set of multiple features which are not explainable but usable in terms of computation of similarities. We can derive these similarity properties from this common shared space. So as soon as you are able to compute the coordinates of these words and put them in the shared space, you can compare them, each word with the other, and decide which are, for example, the most similar words looking at the neighborhood in the shared space. And this is another interesting application of these models. Okay, so let's move on and try to understand how to, so the question is how to compute actually these models. Because, okay, you can probably imagine how you can exploit such a model in order to do some reasoning about the text, but you still don't know how to compute the actual numbers you have to put in the vectors. The vectors are not high dimensional, but still they have a significant number of dimensions, a few hundreds, like 200 or 300 of dimensions. where semantically related units are mapped to similar vectors. So the point is to try to capture some semantic relationship automatically and to learn this kind of representation automatically using a neural network model. What we do is to take a large corpora of documents and try to learn such a representation automatically from the raw text. So we don't rely on human annotation. We don't ask humans to annotate, to write explicitly what are the relationships we expect to see, or at least it's not a traditionally supervised approach. Is what we call the self-supervised approach. So we will design a way to build our training automatically without the need of an explicit annotation. We will leverage some inductive property which reflects the ordering of the words in a piece of text. Of course, these models are also able to capture syntactical properties, so it's not a full separation between syntax and sentence in semantics, but whereas in the former case, the traditional models like TF, IDF may rely on syntax, whereas this is a mix of syntax and semantics. Okay, so how to implicitly annotate the data and to allow to do self-supervision. So to allow the network to generate some new data which are annotated in a way that is suitable for enabling neural network training and inference. The idea, which is called distributional hypothesis, which is very famous and very important in NLP. The distributional hypothesis says, okay, I can characterize your properties, your semantic property, by looking at your company, your neighborhood. So if you look like something, then you probably are similar to, so you have some similar, if you are close to other, I don't know exactly your category, your membership fund, your membership category, but I can look at the neighborhood. I see the company you keep in order to characterize your semantic relationships. So basically, given a target word, you look at the preceding and subsequent words in the raw text. So, okay, given a word, you see when that word occurs in the raw text, which are the words that immediately precede that target word? Which are the words that immediately subsequent that word? So we define what we have already mentioned last week, a context window. What a context window is a window that slides over the raw text and tries to focus the attention of the network on a particular subset of words that are very close to the target one. Of course, if you consider just a few occurrences of the target word, it could be meaningless or even misleading. But if you look at a huge collection of documents, like, for example, the entire Wikipedia set of documents, in that case, you have a so large collection of documents that that samples of neighbors are representative enough to describe the semantic of your word. So you don't know exactly the semantic of that word. Okay, look at the neighborhood, the words in the context window, which are immediately preceding or immediately after, and do this many, many times, because maybe some cases, you get some outliers, some exceptions, something that is actually not really correlated. But in many cases, most cases, you will find some actually semantically related words in the neighborhood of that word. So, for example, if the target word is wonderful, you can take a look to the, typically you consider from 3 to 5 words preceding and from 3 to 5 words subsequent. And this is the context window. So the context window is centered into the target word. The target word is the center one. Is at the center of the context window, and you slice over the text. So here, this is a trivial example because actually you have 2 different words, which are 2 different target words, which retain a strong semantic relation, and we try to figure out such a relation based on the fact that they have a common context of use. So, for example, if 2 guys behave in a similar way, like they go to in the same places, they have the same fun in the same bars, and the same cinemas, they look at the same films. Okay, we can say that they are similar. They have some relation. We do this actually for a different application called the recommendation system. We talked about this later on in this course. It's another application, but in this case, we are investigating how we can automatically define this relation, the blue relation between wonderful and fantastic, which are 2 different target words, which are likely to have common words in their context. This is a kind of supervision, self-supervision, because we know from in an inductive way, a text, something that appears immediately after or immediately before, is strongly related to that word, that target word. This is an inductive process. So we can leverage such a property for enabling the training of the neural network, so in order to capture these properties automatically. Okay, here is just to make this clear. For example, the word banking occurs in many different pieces of text. For example, here you see that the words that are included in the context window, the one in red, are crisis, regulation. So a lot of Europe. So these are words that, let me say, describe the context of use of word banking. So what the researchers have done in their preliminary works on this topic, they have collected a huge amount of general purpose documents, like, for example, Wikipedia documents, which is a very generalistic, a very general purpose. It's not on target and focused on a specific topic, but it's a broad collection. And then try to exploit such a collection in order to define, to train a network, to build automatically your word level representation. So how can we proceed? So the very first step is to collect a large corpus of documents. This is not trivial because, okay, nowadays you have many ways to collect massive amounts of data, but in some very specific cases, you are not able to obtain a so large collection, because if you have only a few tens or even a few hundreds of documents, it's not enough typically, especially when the documents are relatively short, because the neural network training requires a lot of data, and this is one of the main bottlenecks of these models. We need a large corpus of documents. In the preliminary experiments, the authors have proposed to use general models, but of course this is not mandatory. You can try to design your own model, your own representation, domain-specific representation, and this is even more challenging from the point of view of data retrieval, because retrieving documents that are pertinent to a specific topic is even more complex. Then you have to define a word-level vocabulary. Typically, it's the vocabulary associated with the source documents, or, for example, if the documents are written in English, the English vocabulary. If you have some words that are not appearing at all in the source documents, the first model I present you, called the word2vec, is not able to handle them. So it disregards that words, because they do not appear, they never appear in the source data, so the system was unable to include them in the vocabulary. Even if you have a separate vocabulary, the English standard vocabulary, and the separate documents, okay, I have a word in the source vocabulary which never appears in the documents. I cannot describe the actual context of use of that word. So I'm not able to put, to define a description of the word in the Latin space. The vector space includes only the words that actually appear in the documents, at least for the word2vec representation. This is point number 2. Then point number 3 is the self-supervised learning phase, where you have a sliding window that slides over the entire pieces of text and learns something. Tries to capture the contextual use of each of the words in the vocabulary. Actually, this learning phase is, since it is a self-supervision, you need first to build your training samples according to the distributional hypothesis that I have described before, and then to train the network. So you need also the computational power, of course, to train the network properly. Okay? So it's typically more computationally expensive than traditional models like TF-IDF or similar. And finally, you get the word vector representation, which can be exploited in order to, for example, the similarities. And these kind of similarities are helpful, for example, to find, to match, to cluster documents that are similar, not simply based on the same words that co-occur, but even from the point of view of the semantic meaning. The question is, okay, why do we actually need such a neural network training? Because I can leverage the distributional hypothesis in order to build a feature value representation. Okay, if I want to describe a piece of text based on a contextual window, I build my contextual window, my window-based. This is called the window-based occurrence model. Okay, so I define the features manually according to a Windows-based model. So instead of using, for example, the n-grams or the part of speech, I simply build a window, and I use the window in order to define the features without training any neural network model. The problem is that what we get is not scalable at all, because you would generate a huge set of features, and it's not efficient, neither efficient because nor effective, because the complexity in terms of number of words you get in the contextual representation is very, very high. So as you can see here, an example. This is an approach that is actually not used at all. It's not particularly effective. So they have nowadays most of the similar approaches rely on neural networks. But if you don't, you have to build a matrix representation like this. The content of the pieces of text in the upper part of the slide are actually the content of the sentence or of the window. So you build a window, a contextual window. So you split the text according to the content of the contextual window, and you build your own representation. But actually, whenever you have to add new documents, whenever you have to analyze new pieces of text, you need to update such a representation, because the statistics will change. These numbers, which reflect the co-occurrence within a given contextual window, the number of times they co-occur, actually change whenever you add new documents, new pieces of text. When you add new word, you have to again change your model. And then the matrix is not dense, because again you have frequencies which are not capable of building a dense representation of data, which is more suitable for neural network training. So this kind of representation is neither effective nor efficient. So how to solve this issue? In 2013, a researcher from Google has proposed to use neural networks in order to predict which are the surrounding words of a given target word. So they have formalized two complementary tasks, which involve the target words and the surrounding context words. So if you go back, just to have an example. Okay, let's look at the example here. Turning into banking crisis. The contextual word is a word within in the neighborhood, in the contextual window. Banking is the target word. I can formalize the problem, which is, of course, a supervised problem. I wanted to address the problem using neural network. The problem is to predict the words in the contextual window, like crisis, given the fact that I know the target word. So given banking, I want to predict crisis. Given regulation, given banking, I want to predict regulation. What is the likelihood of getting a word regulation in the neighborhood of word banking? This is the task called skipgram. This one. This is the skipgram model. I want to predict the surrounding words given the target word. This is one of the two reference architectures for word2vec. We have two complementary solutions. One is called skipgram, and the other is called CBOW, which stands for Continuous Bag of Words Model. And it is actually the dual, it addresses the dual problem. So given the context, I want to predict the target. Okay, which is, of course, to some extent, a simpler problem, because I know all the words in the context, and I want to predict which is the center word. I know regulation, I know crisis. I want to predict banking. This is CBOW. Of course, we have two different, they have envisioned three different architectures. And, okay, they take as input a large corpora of documents, a dictionary of the words, containing the words occurring in the documents, and it returns a word vector space. So basically, to each word in the vocabulary that actually appears in the source documents, it associates a vector, a fixed size vector of 200 or 300 dimensions, a fixed size vector, which consists of the coordinates of the word in the shared space. The space, the output is a space like this. The output is a space like this, where the circles are the words, which can be described by a set of coordinates. Each word has a vector called word embedding. And then this representation can be used to solve many different, a number of different NLP tasks. Okay, so the way we get this output is to compute for each word in the dictionary the pairwise similarity with every word appearing in its context. So we compute basically a conditional probability. The probability of, in this case, a word appearing in the context to occur, given the fact that they know that the target word has already occurred. So if actually within that window, the context window, I know that the target word that actually occurs is banking. I want to know the probability of getting crisis given banking. And we do this for every potential contextual word. We want to discover probabilities, conditional probabilities conditioned on the occurrence of banking. Of course, what we expect is that crisis regulations are words that have a high likelihood to occur in the context of banking, higher than other words like football or soccer or whatever. Okay, so what we will get for each target word here, a probability distribution. Okay, and we compute this using the softmax function that we have recalled in the last lecture. Softmax returns distribution of probability, a sum of probabilities. The sum is 1. That probabilities are instrumental for adjusting the word vectors. Of course, we want to maximize the probability, of course, because the goal is to find the words in the context given the target. So the network tries to learn how to maximize the probability. So these are the two problems, which are standard. Of course, skipgram ignores the position within the context. So it's the relative position of the words is not so, is either inside the context or outside. If the word is outside, okay, we neglect it. We consider it as either belonging to the context or not. And whether it occurs many times within the context. So if I find a sentence like a crisis in banking, what a crisis? Word crisis occurs twice within the contextual window. But This model actually disregards this, okay? And so we ignore the repetition and we ignore also the position, the relative position. So for example, with respect to banking, the crisis of the banking sector, sector is immediately subsequent with respect to banking, whereas crisis is not immediately preceding. But this model disregards this, okay? So the relative position is either within the context or outside the context. Okay? Any questions? Okay. So we compute that probability. This is for skipgram. We compute the probabilities, which are conditional probabilities. Here, in this example, we consider a window size 2, which is not standard, but in any case, it's not. It's just an example. So the target window is colored in red. The other are the context windows, the words in within the context. Then we slice over the source text, so the sliding window slices, and we now consider word banking instead of into as target word. So what changes is, of course, both the target word and the contextual word. Please. We neglect. We neglect. Yeah, we start from the starting is when you have both preceding and yeah, good question. Actually, this is that because it is a negligible impact, since we have thousands and thousands of documents, so it's a huge dataset collection. Okay. Here is the architecture of the network, which is quite simple. It's not a deep architecture. You have one input, and here we have 4 outputs because we have a contextual window of including 2 preceding words and 2 subsequent words. Okay, so 4 outputs corresponding to the 2 preceding, the 2 most preceding, and the 2 subsequent. Here is a more detailed representation of the architecture, where the vector in the input is as a dimension of v, which is the size of the vocabulary. And then you learn the way, of course. This is a classical learning phase for the network, for the neural network learning. You have an intermediate layer, and then you learn you get the output layer, which is of course again C times V, because V is again the dimension of the size of the vocabulary, and C is the size of the context window. So, given a sequence of training words, the objective, the target is to maximize the average log probability. So we model the problem as a log probability maximization, where the log probability is exactly what we have defined before. And we do this, as you can see, for all the steps for all the slices on the source text, and you have, of course, and also a second index which considers the size of the training context, because within the context you have multiple words to predict. Then, of course, as I told you before, given a target word, we want the words that maximize the conditional probability. And here is the way they use to model softmax, which is here represented as input-output vector representations. So actually they use a variant of the traditional softmax representation, which is quite inefficient because it's proportional to the size of the input dictionary, which is potentially very high, very large. When you have, for example, even in Italian, the Italian vocabulary is quite large. So they use some more efficient way to compute the softmax. One is called hierarchical softmax function. So you try to not evaluate all the output nodes, but only a subset of them in a hierarchical way. So it's detailed correctly. But the point is that they try to compute this formula, which is the hierarchical softmax function, which returns some probabilities. So we get numbers between 0 and 1, and the sum of these probabilities, they sum to 1. So here you have again the formula, the sum over W for all the 1 again. So you can predict which are actually the most likely words that occur within a context of a target word. So what they did in the experiments, and this is also some good indications for the design of your systems, is to have around 300 features, which correspond to 300 neurons. You have roughly 10,000 of words in a vocabulary. Of course, it depends on the language. You cannot mix different languages together. You are not allowed to mix them together because, of course, each language has its own properties. The same word may have different meanings in different languages. So you are not allowed typically to mix Italian and English. And the output is a set of vectors, of word vectors, each one for each word in the vocabulary, which contain the probability that a randomly selected word appears in the neighborhood of the target word. So here is the architecture, yet another representation, just for the sake of clarity, which is, of course, this is the most famous architecture for the very first architecture for deep natural language processing. So it's very important to have this clear in mind. An input which corresponds to a specific word, a specific target word. They have the neurons, which are, in this case, 300. And then they have the softmax, which returns the probability distribution. Like, for example, here on the right-hand side, the probability that a word that is randomly chosen is nearby, so it's in the neighborhood of the target word. And you have one probability value for each of the words in the input vocabulary. Of course, most of the words have a probability which is almost 0, and then of them are likely to have a non-zero probability of occurring in the neighborhood. So here is the representation where you have the output weights multiplied. This is a dot product. And then you apply the softmax function to get probabilities. Now, the converse approach, so the dual approach, is to predict as a target. The target word is actually the target. It's what you want to predict. We know the context in advance, and we want to predict the center word in the sliding window. So as you can see here in the SIBO architecture, you have four inputs, one for each context word, and you want to predict the center one. So I want to predict banking. And I know as an input that the context of use of banking was, I don't know, decreases of sector. So sector is corresponds to WT plus 1, because it's the word immediately subsequent the target word that I want to predict. WT plus 2 is the word that is after the immediately subsequent one. So here is the formulation, which is quite straightforward, because we try to estimate the log, to maximize the log of the probability, the conditional probability of a center word given all the words in the context. Where M here is they use a different notation with respect to compared to the previous one. M is here the size of the training context. And the previous one is C. I'm sorry for the inconsistency. And you have you need to have in advance the context of the word, but it's self-supervised, so you don't need a human expert which provides you with a set of contextual words. It tries to learn it automatically from a raw piece of text. This is the essence of self-supervision. We will see many different cases of self-supervision in NLP, because there are many ways to induce, to exploit this inductive bias from the way you write or the way you speak. Okay, so here you can see the representation, where again, these are the input vectors, where the size is C, here again, the size of the contextual window multiplied by V. V is the size of the vocabulary. Then the layer for projection is of size N is typically 300 or 250 or whatever. And then the output is just a single output, a single neuron output, a single output of size V, because you have a probability for each of the words in the vocabulary to be the center word given the context. Okay, if you want, you can read further. Here is the paper, the original paper, where actually there are also some links to one other preceding paper. But okay, if you are interested in, you can read through this paper. It contains also several examples or tests they have performed on real data. Let me just briefly mention some optimizations. They have to build the training set. How to build the training set? You slice over text, and you consider the properties of the contextual window to build your own samples. But you have, in this case, you have positive samples and negative samples. What is positive means that the correspondence between a center word and a contextual word. And this is the case for only just few words, because we have one center word, 4, 5, 6, or no more than 10 contextual words, just few words. So the combinations actually are few, and you have many other negative samples. It meaning that you have many words that actually do not occur in the context of the target word. So each training sample triggers the update on only a small percentage of weights, because actually, if you have many negative samples, you lose time in your training, because network actually do not learn so much about that specific context. So there are some ways to sample to reduce the number of negative samples, which are a lot, whereas you keep all the positive ones, which are relevant. And in this way, you, let me say, rebalance the original training set. So in the negative sampling, basically, for the skip run model, for example, they update, they perform updates to the weights only for a very large number of weights. So instead of doing this, which is computationally expensive, you randomly select only a subset of negative words to update, to do the updates. So you, it's a sort of undersampling of the negative class. Okay, so you have negative examples, which are significantly more frequent than positive ones. So since you have a class imbalance, you pick randomly only a subset of the negative samples, and whereas you keep the positive ones as in the original distribution. This is a sort of undersampling of the negative class. And this is an example of manual generation of the training samples. You also have cases where some words are pretty common in text. For example, if you analyze speech, there are some ways, some forms, some recurrent ways to say that are not really significant. So again, you can apply some sampling in order to reduce the impact of such words. So for example, a stop word actually appears many times in a text. It has a relatively high frequency of occurrence. This can be in traditional representation, text representations is managed by removing stop words whenever they are not relevant, because we want to reduce the dimensionality of your data. But here, for word embedding models, this is not the common way to handle this, because in many cases, by removing stop words, by deleting some parts, some piece of text, you alter the structure, the sequence, the original sequence. So what happens is that when you slice over the text, you have some gaps, and you may misunderstand the actual context of the target word. So it's not always recommended to do stemming and stop word prior to applying models like word embedding. They are applied only in very special cases, not in a standard pipeline, including word to back, for example. It's not usual to apply stop word elimination. Whereas if you have to compute on occurrence-based representation, like for the FIDF, the entity file, it is quite common to avoid including these words. Even for these words, you have many samples, and you can to describe their context. So it's quite it's a waste of computational resources to keep updating the weights of these vectors, because they are actually meaningless. By comparing the two architectures, skipgram and SIBO, what we see is that, of course, SIBO is faster. Skipgram is better to capture the semantic meaning, but it's solving a slightly complex task, because we have to predict each of the words in the context, not simply the target word. SIBO is more sensitive to frequency word imbalance, because if you have, for example, many different stop words, the samples in the symbol distribution are more sensitive to this negative effect, especially because you target on a single word and not on each of the words in the context. And then at the end, you also have a problem of computational time. So XIBO is faster. It's recommended when you don't have enough computational resources, especially when you have, for example, a limited availability of GPUs or similar. What is really interesting in these models is that you can do a pre-training of these models on a large document corpus. Then you store the model you get, so the vectors, and you reuse them, okay? Provided that the source documents are representative enough for your purposes, you can keep and reuse the word vector model that you have generated previously. So you don't need to redo the computation from scratch every time. And here is, you have further additional readings on this topic. Okay, I think we can take a break. Okay. Could you hear me? Get to sleep. Okay, it seems working. I told you that Word2Vec is a pioneering work for word embedding. And after that, many research works have tried to refine and address the issues of Word2Vec model. We will see today a couple of extensions of Word2Vec, which are aimed at overcoming specific issues related to Word2Vec. But prior to that, I would like to briefly describe how to evaluate the quality of the Word2Vec vectors. Because of course, you can get a collection of documents, whatever, either general purpose or domain specific. You can get a state-of-the-art model, or even your own modified version of Word2Vec model, and train the word vector, compute the word vectors. Are they good enough to address specific NLP tasks? Are they actually representative of significant textual relationships? Are they retaining actually semantic properties? In order to assess the quality of these models, you have two main strategies, which are complementary. The first one is called intrinsic evaluation. Okay, thank you for the feedback. The first one is intrinsic evaluation, and entails evaluating the model against some prior knowledge, some ground truth. So you ask domain experts to provide you with some annotated data, and you leverage such a knowledge, prior knowledge, in order to evaluate the quality of the output of the Word2Vec model. And the other approach is called extrinsic evaluation, is not to evaluate the quality of the vectors as themselves, but rather to evaluate the quality of the vector in addressing a specific issue. For example, is the Word2Vec representation suitable for computing word analogies? Yes or no? Is the representation useful for example, looking for synonyms? So some, of course, NLP specific task that you can try to accomplish using this kind of automated data-driven approaches. And you compare, of course, the performance of these models with that of existing traditional models, which are in some cases very accurate, but also not very flexible, are very limited in terms of portability towards other languages, towards other contexts, are not flexible enough because they do not handle neologism or alternative ways of expressing the same concept using different words. So, of course, you can evaluate the pros and the cons of these approaches and decide which are the most appropriate for your purposes. A key step in Word2Vec word vectors application is the computation of the vector similarity. Because given two words, you are interested in computing, finding, for example, given a target word, you look at the words in the neighborhood that are most similar. Of course, the more similar the words are, the closer are in the space. Okay? If two words are similar from both syntactical and semantic point of view, they are likely to be placed in the same area of the shared latent space. So they have roughly the same coordinates. Okay? So if I compute the distance, pointwise distance between these two words, we can estimate how these two words, this pair of words are similar. And of course, we can do the comparison between many different pairs of words and decide which are, for example, the words that are most similar to others. For example, if you have to automatically fill a query text, if you type a query, your query is not complete, and the system automatically suggests you additional words. This is a way, simple yet effective way, to do this. So to recommend additional words that are potentially related to. Of course, this misses the sequential property, but captures the semantic relation. Okay? One of the most popular ways to compute the similarity is to use cosine similarity. It's not mandatory, but it's common. It's very, very common. Cosine similarity is basically an estimate of the angle between the two vectors. If you want to compute, to estimate the effectiveness of your word vectors to address, for example, word analogy, you can solve the problem as in the formula, like man is related to woman, as king is related to what. You want to find queen. You start from the vector of man. You sum the vector of, for example, in this case, you subtract the vector of woman, you sum the vector of king, so you do some algebraic operation, pointwise operations, component by component, and you will come up with a vector, a new vector, which is the combination of the two, like this. Okay? So you will get a resulting vector, which is, of course, potentially not corresponding to any existing word vector. So the output of this algebraic operation is simply a vector in a latent space, which has specific coordinates, which maybe do not necessarily correspond to an existing word. And they are likely to be a new word, which actually does not correspond to any existing word in the vocabulary, but it's close to other words in the common space. Which is the word that is closest to your resulting vector? Okay, actually you do this, the procedure is like this. You do the algebraic operation, like computing similarity, pairwise similarity, or summing and subtracting vectors according to these properties. You get an output in terms of a vector, and you look at the neighbor, the k nearest neighbors of that resulting word vector. Okay, and of course the answer here is in, because it's the nearest word with respect to the resulting vector. Of course, is queen if it is the right answer. Okay. The authors of the paper have tried to apply such a procedure to solve many different examples. These are examples taken from the paper, where they try to, for example, to compute the difference between Paris and France, and then they sum Italy, and the nearest token, the nearest word in the space was Rome. You can do this, for example, for Windows, you subtract Microsoft, you sum Google. These are 3 vectors. You sum and subtract component by component. You get a new resulting vector, which actually is not necessarily corresponding to an existing word, but the closest to the resulting vector is Android. So it makes sense. Okay? So usually you look at, you apply a strategy similar to some information retrieval system. So you check whether, in order to evaluate the capability of your system to retain semantic properties, you get your result, you know the ground truth, so you know that you want to get Queen or Rome or Android. So you know what is the ground truth. You look at, check whether the expected word occurs in the top 3, top 5, top 10 words in the neighbor. And then you can compute, you can estimate, you can quantify the quality of your system as a search model with quantities like recall, precision. So the recall at K, where K is the number of top items that you consider. Okay? There exist already some pre-trained models that you can download and use without redoing the computation from scratch. They are typically general purpose, like a Wikipedia model, and they are language specific because each language has its own words, its own properties. If you want to have in a different language, you have to train it separately. But they can, of course, reuse for different purposes and shared. Here you can find some example of models. The first one is the Wikipedia corpus is general purpose, whereas the Google News is more focused on media-related topics. There are also some approaches to tailor the word vector representation to specific domains. You can either consider as an initial collection a bunch of documents all related to a topic. And of course, this is the optimal case because your vectors are not only semantically relevant, but also topic specific. But this is not easy to find a suitable corpora of documents because you need a lot of documents to train the neural network. So in some cases, you start from a general purpose one and you keep training the network on domain-specific words. What happens is that the initial distribution of the words in the latent space roughly changes. So they move some of the words that are actually relevant to the domain, to the topic under analysis, likely change their relative position in the space. Whereas all the words that are not relevant to that particular topic or domain keep their coordinates in the space unchanged. You can also do something that is called domain adaptation, which means trying to switch the domain from one to another. Again, trying to keep training the model. So there are also some procedures in like incremental ways. It means you keep what was already trained before. You keep training the model. You keep update the model by adding new documents that are specific to a given topic. Okay. It depends, of course, on your purposes. If you have to solve a task that is extremely domain specific, like, for example, I want to do sentiment analysis on financial news, no way to use general purpose model because they are for sure not performing well. So you do have to adapt the representation to the domain. So here is an example. In sentiment analysis, you can adapt the representation of the data to a particular domain, where a word may have a completely different sentiment, so is associated with a different feeling according to the domain. So if it is general purpose, it may be neutral. If it is specifically related to some disordered dataset, then it carries on a negative sentiment. So it's dependent on the domain under analysis. Of course, if you use the wrong pre-trained model, you may incur in misleading results. So it's a domain adaptation. It's a kind of refinement of the original model, which consists in a translation or rotation of the original vector according to what is the influence of the distribution of the new documents you add, and mainly referring to the word-specific, domain-specific words. So it's not likely to influence the distribution of the other words that are not related to the domain. So a part of the vector space remains unchanged, whereas some other slightly move and change their relative positions. A common way is also to identify and try to focus on specific pivot words that are domain specific. This is what also computational linguistic experts usually do. In order to characterize a domain, they try to highlight what are the keywords that are most peculiar to a given domain. You can do this automatically or a sort of like semi-automatically doing domain adaptation. So you look, you take a snapshot before and after, and you see what has changed. What changed is are the coordinates of the pivot words. So there are two different approaches. You can either discover the pivot words in an unsupervised way, in a supervised fashion, or rely on some supervised model where some domain expert has specified, has told you, okay, these are the words that are mainly most relevant to this domain. There are also applications and research works related to the alignment of the vector space in different languages. Because I told you, okay, you cannot train a word-to-vec model on a bunch of documents written in different languages, because you are gonna mix meanings according to different syntactical and semantic rules, so completely different meanings. But if you have two different models, two different word vectors of different languages, you can map the words in a language with the corresponding translation. Such a mapping is usually called a lexicon. This is called bilingual lexicon. So it's a kind, you can, in a simplified way, you can map, you say, okay, the word automobile in Italian is the translation of the English word car. Okay, this is a mapping between Italian and English. You can leverage such a mapping in order to do a so-called alignment between the two word vector space. The goal is to try to have a mix, a combination of word vector representation in a bilingual context, where you can compute similarities between documents written in different languages. And you can do it using different approaches, either supervised or unsupervised. Actually, the best performing ones are, of course, supervised, because you have some prior knowledge. It can be useful for example, for machine translation, even if, as we will see later on in this course, the best performer are do not rely on word embeddings, but on transformers right now. But of course, this is a possible way to tackle the issue. The unsupervised approach consists in learning a transformation from the source from a source language to a target. So how can we map the words in a source language, so the one vector in the source in the common data space of a source language with the corresponding word in the target. This is an empirical way. This is pretty much similar to a statistical approach to machine learning, where you have to compute the probability that a source piece of text, a piece of text in the source language can be mapped into another piece of text in the target language. You can do this using word embeddings. Supervised approaches instead try to leverage some bilingual lexicon, which are human generated, human annotated. So you know the translations, at least at the word level, which is not the best you can do, of course, but it's at least a good starting point. And you learn more how to refine it, how to extend, how to apply it in order to translate the other words. Okay, now, given this, we have completed the overview of the word-to-vec model and how to exploit such a model or evaluate such a model. But in some cases, word-to-vec is not enough, or it's not appropriate. So we want now to focus on the main drawbacks of word-to-vec. I have summarized the main limitations of word-to-vec in this slide. So first of all, you focus on a binary model, considering either the membership or not to a contextual window. So you are actually neglecting or giving less importance to the natural sequence of the words, the ordering of appearance of the words. All the words that appear within the context are the same, pretty the same, and all the words that are outside are not considered according to the distributional hypothesis. This is not what we did, for example, when we talk about RNN networks or LSTM, which are the most commonly used recurrent neural networks. Second problem, the so-called out-of-vocabulary issue. What is an out-of-vocabulary issue? What is an out-of-vocabulary word? A word that is out of the source vocabulary. A neologism, for example. If I search, I look for a word in the Treccani vocabulary, the standard vocabulary. It might happen that if it is a neologism, a new word, a new form of a new expression, it might not occur. It might not be present in my vocabulary. And even worse, it might not be present in the source documents. Okay, because if the word has appeared in many documents, I can do self-supervision. I learn, I refine, I update my initial vocabulary by adding the words that were not present before, okay? And we solve the issue. But what happens if the word is actually missing in the source documents? For example, if I want to compute similarities in, I don't know, papers related to, I don't know, bioinformatics, there are some acronyms or domain-specific words that might not be present in the Wikipedia documents, because in the Wikipedia corpus includes general purpose description, which are not describing the topics at a so deep level of detail. So they miss some very specific concepts and words. What happens in that case? You are not able to include that word in the common space, and you miss that information. The third problem is related to the kind of documents you are going to analyze. There are some kinds of documents that are particularly complex and peculiar in terms of structure and way of or lack of structure or type of structure. For example, Twitter messages are relatively short pieces of text. The older version was, the older constraint was at most 140 characters. So it's very, very short message. No structure. Is it actually the same to train a model on a Twitter dataset or on a Wikipedia web page? Of course not. There are problems related to the fact that here the sliding process is not very effective. You miss something. Could be partly effective, but you miss something. Because again, the text has a particular structure which is not similar to other documents. And finally, you also miss the information about the context. So there are some words that change some pieces of text that have different meanings according to the context. So the contextual characterization of the use of a word or a piece of text is relevant to many applications. For example, hate speech or misogyny detection or fake news detection. So there are challenging tasks where you actually need to deeply understand the context of use of the word. And this is not the case for word-to-vec. This is the case for more advanced models called contextualized embeddings, which also include some very famous models like BERT. The first extension, the first famous extension of established extension of word2vec is called fasttext. Has been proposed by Facebook researchers, but actually one of the co-authors is in common because one of the word2vec was Nikolov, which was in Google and then moved to Facebook, so it's same current ongoing work. He tried to extend the capabilities of the word2vec models in order to overcome the auto-vocabulary issue. Basically, he relaxed the constraint on the type of unit, or textual unit you consider. In word2vec, we have only considered word-level embeddings. So an entire word was the word unit. Instead, in fasttext, we consider n-grams of characters. So we decompose an entire word into subparts. We also call them subwords, which are sequences of characters. We call them, more formally speaking, they are character n-grams. So n, a sequence of n characters. By incorporating subword information, we enrich the original representation of the text in a way that is suitable for describing, for inferring the vector representation of a new word which was missing in the initial vocabulary. So the idea is quite simple. You have a new word which was out of vocabulary. You have no clue on how to encode such an information because you don't see any occurrence in the input data. You decompose the word into parts, roughly speaking, the subwords. The subwords are likely to occur separately in your data. So you can pick the subword embeddings that you are able to compute similar to the original words in board2vec, and you combine the vector representations of the subwords in order to estimate, to approximate the vector representation of the new word. So the out-of-vocabulary word is roughly the vector representation, the embedding of the out-of-vocabulary word is estimated as a combination of the vector representations derived by the original model from the subwords. So here is a representation where you tokenize the text, no longer word-wise, but you tokenize according to character n-grams. So subwords consisting of 3, 4, 5 characters in a row. Typically, we not consider simply one character or two characters because they are not relevant enough. They commonly consider, if I remember well, oh, okay, from 3 to 6. The number are 3 to 6. Okay. When you consider, while considering shorter n-grams, you are able typically to capture syntactical properties of the text in a better way, whereas when you consider longer n-grams, you are also able to capture more semantically relevant relationships. It's not a fixed size n of n. You can also include a range, so between n 3 and 6, not exactly 4, exactly 5. And the representation of a word here is a sum of the character n-gram based vectors that compose it. Okay? This means that you are able to estimate the vector of an arbitrary word, provided that you know which is the composition of that word in terms of subwords. Of course, this is an extension of the board2vec model, so it's not mandatory to use subwords. If you already have a vector representation of the entire word, please use it. So you don't discard or disregard the word level representation. You also include the subword representation. This is a very simple example. Actually, it's not very realistic because it also includes b-grams, but okay, this is just an example. You have decomposed the entire word into parts, and you have many different subwords which are potentially relevant to build the embedding vector of a new word, as well as the vector of the entire word where. So you don't miss the vectors of the entire word that you are able to estimate. And you can also distinguish between the vector of her, which is actually a word, a meaningful word, a pronoun, which is different from her as a subword of were. Okay? So you may consider both. The authors have computed the predatory vectors for many, many languages using a combination of Wikipedia and Common Crawl documents. It's a very, very large collection of documents, even more than Wikipedia, so it's huge. And they try to build the representation of the language-specific models, as well as the aligned versions. So versions that can be used to put some pieces of text, multilingual pieces of text within the same common space. And this is called the pre-trained aligned model. And it is available for 45 most spoken languages. So it's a quite rich and interesting source. They, of course, include both words and subwords. So this model is inherently more complex, more large, so more complex to handle, to process, than the original word-to-vector model. Any questions? Please. No, they are associated with different tokens, so different inputs. You basically generate a list of tokens as input. They have different ID, different things. You miss the correlation. Any other questions? Here, if you apply some edit distance, so distances between string, the two tokens are exactly the same, but they are, according to word-to-vec or fast text, they are completely different. Yes, of course. Then, another extension is called Glove. Glove is a model proposed by a Stanford University professor called Manning. The idea here is to, let me say, roughly speaking, take the best of the two words. And the words are narrow network-based and the occurrence-based representations. Okay? Because as you probably, as you can imagine, there are contexts like tweets, for example, where probably occurrence-based models are not so bad, because the window-based approach of self-supervision and the idea of the dimensionality of representation of the data, the induction of the network is suboptimal in some cases. And these are the cases where it is beneficial using a mix of the two. So they try to use both neural network learning and word co-occurrences. So they estimate, they compute the classical word matrix with some weighting function like simple frequency or TF-IDF. These actually, they don't use simple frequency, but this is a technical detail I will show you later on. And then once you have the occurrence-based representation, you try to leverage it during the network learning phase. So it's you get a mix of the two. It is not always beneficial, of course, but it can be, especially when you have to cope with relatively short documents, like, for example, Twitter messages. Have you ever heard about this kind of model? No? Okay. So the idea is not to use actually simple frequencies because they could be misleading. And they have shown this in the paper as with the simple example. Here you have a probed word, and you count the co-occurrence probabilities of that probed word given a selected context. Wi, Wy are the contextual words. So you compute the probabilities, the conditional probabilities of the word given a contextual word. There are words that are not related at all to the context. For example, fashion. Fashion is not related to ice, steam, okay? Whereas solid, gas are actually correlated to. So what we see here is that in some cases, when you rank the word relevance within a context based on a simple frequency counts or co-occurrence-based co-occurrence probabilities, you may incur in some undesired errors or misleading results because due to the presence of noise, of noisy effects. So a simple way, simple yet effective way to counteract such a noisy effect is to no longer consider simple co-occurrence frequencies, but rather the ratio of the co-occurrences, of the conditional co-occurrences. So you are able, if you consider the ratio between the word given ice and the ratio between and x given steam, the ratio of the concurrence probabilities are less likely to be noisy, so are more representative. They have demonstrated it in an empirical way, and this holds especially for particularly complex distributions like social network data or similar. So this approach is simply to, let me say, filter out noisy combinations, noisy relationship between words. But then, at the end, the idea is to rely on an occurrence-based model, which here starts from the ratio of the co-occurrence probabilities, but these are weights, as we did for TF-IDF, TF-DF, BM25, or whatever. These weights will be also considered in the vector space model. The computation relies on these formulas, which are quite simple, actually. And then they basically, I missed this step. They try to, during the learning phase, they also provide this information, this weighting information to the network in order to refine the weighting phase. So the idea is to embed also the occurrence-based information during the vector space learning, which is something that is not considered by previous models like word-to-back or fast-text. I can show you a couple of examples here. I have to share my screen also from the virtual classroom. No. Okay. Probably here the text is too small. We need to. Okay, here is the main page of the GLOVE project. Here you can, all these models are open source, so you can download them and use. There are many projects, related projects, where either the original authors, co-authors, or other researchers have shared some pre-trained models. So please do not redo the computation of word embedding from scratch if there are some intermediate points, so you can save a lot of memory computation and a lot of time, especially because the original sources for pre-training the models are typically very large. So here you can look at the examples. They again try to evaluate the models using cosine similarity, and they applied, as you can see here, extrinsic evaluation according to some similarity problems. So look for words that are mainly related to a target word. They have plotted some examples of representations, like here. As you can see here, they apply dimensionality reduction in order to plot these results in a 2D space. But the idea was to find associations between words, like Chrysler, Fiat Chrysler, which was one of the former companies now belonging to the Stellantis corporate, and Marchionne, which was the former CEO of FCA. So these are associations between companies and persons, which have been automatically detected. This is a typical example of extrinsic evaluation. Of course, you can say they have applied the solution to a very specific case. I agree with you. So it's not trivial. You cannot say, okay, this model works in a specific context. You can apply it in whatever other context. This is not the case. Actually, you have to verify your model in the context of interest. Test it first in order to check the feasibility its applicability. There are many studies that focus on doing transfer learning. So they try to learn something in a context and try to bring what they learned in another context. So it's a sort of domain adaptation, but in some cases, in this case, in the most common cases when you have some annotations, some annotated data, some data with annotations. You train a model, and then you want to apply this model even in some slightly different context, but you don't have new training data. You don't want to spend more money in annotating the data and collecting new data. So you try to reuse what you have. In this case, it happens you have less constraints in the sense that you have you are in a self-supervised scenario, so you don't need to human data, but you need to have a lot of data. So you need to have a lot of domain topic data. So this is not always the case. So in this case, you can try to figure out, you can test transfer learning paradigm. Here is another example. This is the official page of FastX project. It includes, of course, the source code, which is again open source. You can download even the scripts for testing the model. You will play with these models next week during the lab. So next week will be fully devoted to using these kind of models. You have here some examples of evaluation datasets that you can use also to test your model, different models or adapted models to benchmarks for which you know or in advance the performance of the state of the art. And you also have some pre-trained models. So when you don't have enough computational resources or computational time, you can try to reuse what the authors have previously trained on their own. So you trust on the pre-trained model. Pay attention because here you cannot apply domain adaptation. Okay, so you cannot just simply modify the distribution by keep training the model, because you have the concept of subword, which are related. So you do composition even in the original model. So you cannot simply keep training the model and modifying the position, the relative position of the vectors in the space. Domain adaptation is not suitable for FastX, whereas it is suitable for example, for Word2Vec. Here you have a list, or a long list of models which are multilingual and aligned. So these are these are not aligned. This means each model works on a specific language, full stop. But there is also a subset of models like this, which are already aligned. Okay? So they can work in the common Latin space. Okay? And this property, such a property is very, very interesting. Of course, you can see by simply exploring this collection, you can see also the differences in terms of languages. So, for example, if you look at the Hindi collection is very, very small. The model is very, very small compared to other languages like English or Spanish, even because the sources of data are orders of magnitude smaller. If you look at, if you try to crawl in documents written in Hindi from Wikipedia, you find only few documents. Whereas if you try to crawl English written documents, you find a huge amount of sources. Okay, so here, of course, my suggestion is to try to look at what is available online without with open source code, open source models. We will try to use them next lab, so next week. In the meanwhile, we go on with the program. We will introduce new models, which are more capable of capturing the structure of the text. The next step will be sentence-level models. They try to combine, not to model, to represent not simply a single word, but a combination of words. And of course, we can do this in a very simple way, just simply combining the words. But so we, as you already know, according to the what we see, we have seen this lecture, you can simply sum, using some algebraic expression, sum the vector representations of singular words. But this is not as good as building, learning a sentence-level representation of the text. So this is what we introduce next lecture, where we talk about sentence-level embeddings. Any questions? Okay, so we can conclude here the lesson. So we can start the next topic on Friday. So see you on Friday.